Good morning, everyone. My name is Carol Stowell, and I want to welcome everyone to our service here at the Unitarian Universalist Congregation of York. I'm helping to lead the service today. Our minister, Reverend Terry Cummings, is off this week, and we are privileged to have our guest speaker, Rabbi Michael Pollack, whom I have known for 5 years. His service is dedicated to the prophets of ancient Israel and is titled, "The Most Disturbing People Who Ever Lived." During his last year in rabbinical school, Rabbi Michael co-founded March on Harrisburg, a group dedicated to making corruption illegal and taking our democracy where it's never been by passing anti-corruption, pro-democracy bills in Pennsylvania. Steve Snell and I happen to be co-chairs of the York chapter of March on Harrisburg, and you can join our monthly meetings by Zoom. Look in your chat box for details if you're interested. If you did, you'd have opportunities to lobby, to march, and maybe even go to jail with us. Yay! Michael lives in Philadelphia, and his hobbies include convincing politicians to not be corrupt, long marches through the Pennsylvania countryside, and sitting down in inconvenient places in the state capitol. This Sunday, we're also pleased to share with you some music provided by Gretchen Decker and Lydia Paulus, as well as other music sources. Our Zoom and planning experts are Doug Hobert and Robert Felton. Thank you, both Doug and Robert. UUCY is a religious community that inspires the mind and spirit, honors religious freedom, and embraces diversity. Our members minister to each other with love and work together for a just society. And so we come together again this morning for worship and for fellowship as we greet old friends and new visitors alike. In keeping with our Unitarian Universalist tradition, we light a chalice or a candle as we begin our service, and you may want to do that wherever you are. I now will ask Rabbi Michael to open up our service with our words of gathering. Thank you, Michael.
Thank you all, and so good to see so many familiar faces, and I'm stunned that a service is starting on time. This is really amazing stuff to me. I'm going to begin with a quote from Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel. He once said, "The prophets were the most disturbing people who ever lived. The prophet is a person who is able to hold God and humanity in one thought at one time at all times, which means that whatever I do to humanity, I do to God. When I hurt a human being, I injure the divine. The prophet is the kind of person who combines a very deep love, a very powerful dissent, a painful rebuke with unwavering hope. The prophet is a witness to the great mystery, what I would call the meaning beyond mystery. And I've learned from the prophets that I have to be involved in the affairs of humanity, in the affairs of suffering people."
Soon the day will arrive when we will be together, and no longer will we live in fear. Children will smile without wonder.
We're going to do a story for children, but really for everybody. And the story I'm going to read today is from Isaac Bashevis Singer. He won a Nobel Prize for Literature in the mid-1900s. And it's a story about the wise elders of Chelm, who are actually not that wise. I'm telling this story because the prophets often had an adversarial approach to people in power. They would be challenging those in power. And before you can challenge those in power, it's important to remember that despite all of their pomp and circumstance, despite all of their official trappings, despite all of their arrogance, they're usually not that in charge as they would like you to think. And so the stories of Chelm, of the wise elders of Chelm, really challenge the arrogance of the Tsar and challenge the arrogance of those in power. So this is a story called The Fools of Chelm and the Stupid Carp. In Chelm, a city of fools, everybody bought fish for Shabbat, for the Sabbath. The rich bought large fish, the poor bought small ones. They were bought on Thursday, cut up, and made into gefilte fish on Friday, and eaten on Saturday. One Thursday morning, the door opened at the house of the community leader of Chelm, Granum Ox, and Zinval Nini entered, carrying a trough full of water. Inside was a large, live carp. "What is this?" Granum asked. "A gift to you from the wise men of Chelm," Zinval said. "This is the largest carp ever caught in the lake of Chelm, and we all decided to give it to you as a token of appreciation for your great wisdom." "Thank you very much," Granum Ox replied. "My wife Yenta Pesha will be delighted. She and I both love carp. I actually read in a book that eating the brain of a carp increases wisdom. And even though we in Chelm are immensely clever already, a little bit of improvement never hurts. But let me have a close look at him. I was told that a carp's tail shows the size of his brain." Granum Ox was known to be nearsighted, and when he bent down to the trough to better observe the carp's tail, the carp did something that proved he was not as wise as Granum thought. He lifted his tail and smacked Granum across the face. Granum Ox was flabbergasted. "Something like this has never happened to me before," he exclaimed. "I cannot believe this carp was caught in the Chelm Lake. A Chelm carp should know better." "He's the meanest fish I ever saw in my life," agreed Zinval Nini. Even though Chelm is a big city, news traveled quickly there. In no time at all, the other wise men of Chelm arrived at the house of their leader, Granum Ox. Treadle Fool came, and Sender Donkey, Shmendrik Numbskull, and Dopey Lakish. Granum Ox was saying, "I am not going to eat this fish on Shabbat. This carp is a fool, and malicious to boot. If I eat him, I could become foolish instead of more clever." "Then what shall I do with him?" asked Zinval Nini. Granum Ox put a finger to his head as a sign that he was thinking hard. After a while, he cried out, "No person or animal in Chelm should ever slap Granum Ox. This fish needs to be punished." "What kind of punishment shall we give him?" asked Treadle Fool. "All fish are killed anyhow, and one cannot kill a fish twice." "He shouldn't be killed like other fish," Sender Donkey said. "He should die in a different way to show that no one can smack our beloved sage Granum Ox and get away with it." "What kind of death?" wondered Shmendrik Numbskull. "Shall we perhaps just imprison him?" "Well, there is no prison in Chelm for fish," said Zinval Nini, "and to build such a prison would take too long." "Maybe he should be hanged," suggested Dopey Lakish. "How do you hang a carp?" Sender Donkey wanted to know. "A creature can be hanged only by its neck, but since a carp has no neck, how will you hang him?" "My advice is that he should be thrown to the dogs," said Treadle Fool. "It's no good," Granum Ox answered. "Our Chelm dogs are both smart and modest, but if they eat this carp, they may become as stupid and mean as he is." "So what should we do?" all the wise men asked. "This case needs a lengthy consideration," Granum Ox decided. "Let's leave the carp in the trough and ponder the matter as long as is necessary. Being the wisest man in Chelm, I cannot afford to pass a sentence that will not be admired by all the people of Chelm. If the carp stays in the trough a long time, he may die," Zinval Nini, who was a former fish dealer, explained. "To keep him alive, we must put him into a large tub, and the water has to be changed often, and he must also be fed properly. You are right, Zinval, Granam Ox told him. Go and find the largest tub in Chelm and see to it that the carp is kept alive and healthy until the day of judgment. When I reach a decision, you will hear about it. Of course, Granam's words were the law in Chelm. The 5 wise men went and found a large tub, filled it with fresh water, and put the criminal carp in it, together with some crumbs of bread, challah, and other tidbits that a carp might like to eat. Shlomiel, Granam's bodyguard, was stationed at the tub to make sure that no greedy Chelmites would come and try to turn the carp into gefilte fish. But it just so happened that Granam Ox had many other decisions to make, and he kept postponing the sentence. The carp seemed not to be impatient. He ate, swam in the tub, became even fatter than he had been, not realizing that a severe sentence hung over his head. Shlomiel changed the water frequently because he was told that if the carp died, this would be an act of contempt for Granam Ox and for the Chelm Court of Justice. Yuckel the water carrier made a few extra pennies every day by bringing water for the carp. Some of the Chelmites who were in opposition to Granam Ox spread the gossip that Granam just couldn't find the right type of punishment for the carp, and that he was waiting for the fish to die a natural death. But as always, a great disappointment awaited them. One morning, about half a year later, the sentence became known, and when it was known, Chelm was stunned. The carp had to be drowned. Granam Ox had thought up many clever sentences before, but never one as brilliant as this one. Even his enemies were amazed at his shrewd verdict. Drowning is just the kind of death suited to a spiteful carp with a large tail and a small brain. That day, the entire Chelm community gathered at the lake to see the sentence executed. The carp, which had become almost twice as big as he had been before, was brought to the lake in the wagon that carried the worst criminals to their death. The drummers drummed, trumpets blared. The Chelmite executioner raised the heavy carp and threw it into the lake with a mighty splash. A great cry arose from the Chelmites. Down with the treacherous carp! Long live Granam Ox! Hooray! Granam was lifted by his admirers and carried home with songs of praise. Some Chelmites showered him with flowers. Even Yenta Pesha, his wife, who was often critical of Granam and even dared to call him a fool. She seemed pretty impressed by Granam's high intelligence. In Chelm, as everywhere else, there were envious people who found fault with everyone, and they began to say that there was no proof whatsoever that the carp really drowned. Why should a carp drown in lake water, they asked. While hundreds of innocent fish are killed every Friday, they said, that stupid carp lived in comfort for months on the taxpayers' money, and then was returned sound and healthy to the lake, where he is laughing at Chelm justice. But only a few listened to these malicious words. They pointed out that months passed and the carp was never caught again, a sure sign that he was dead. It is true that the carp just might have decided to be careful and to avoid the fisherman's net. But how can a foolish carp who slaps Granam Ox have such wisdom? Just the same, to be on the safe side, the wise elders of Chelm published a decree that if the nasty carp had refused to be drowned and was caught again, a special jail should be built for him, a pool where he would be kept prisoner for the rest of his life. The decree was printed in the official Gazette of Chelm and signed by Granam Ox and the 5 sages.
העולם כולו, גשר צר מאוד כל העולם הוא גשר צר כל העולם כולו, גשר צר מאוד כל העולם הוא גשר As I walk along this very narrow bridge, I will not be afraid, knowing you are with me. As I walk along this very narrow bridge, I will not fear, knowing you are near. והעיקר לא לפחד כלל, לא לפחד, והעיקר לא לפחד כלל, לא לפחד, לא לפחד כלל.
The prophets. The prophets were rabble-rousers. They were moral voices. They were activists. They were poets. They were preachers. They were voices of reason. They were voices of panic. They were comforters and consolers. They were mourners and dreamers. The more corrupt, violent, and miserable society became, the louder the prophets become. They challenged the king. They challenged the ruling class. They challenged the people. They are the most disturbing people who ever lived. The prophets believed in a world that is sympathetic to us. The prophets believed that the universe is moral and its arc bends toward justice, that life wants life. The prophet has an overwhelming and overbearing certainty that there is meaning beyond mystery, that holiness conquers absurdity, and that without holiness, we will sink in absurdity. The prophet is called by that meaning beyond mystery to beg the people to accept holiness and to rise above the absurdities of artificial suffering. The world cares about us. God cares. The divine cares. The universe is sympathetic. Abraham Joshua Heschel said that the biggest message of the Bible, of the prophets of Israel, is that God takes people seriously, that justice is a divine concern. History, according to the prophets, is a partnership between God and the people. God is in tenacious solidarity with people, and the prophet is in tenacious solidarity with God and with the people. To use an example that might be familiar, think of the Lorax. The Lorax speaks for the trees. The Lorax is in solidarity with the trees. And the Lorax tries to warn people not to mess with the trees. And in this worldview, every human rights issue becomes a religious issue. Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel's opposition to the Vietnam War 50 years ago was because, quote, what does God demand of us primarily? Justice and compassion. What does God condemn above all? Murder, killing innocent people. How can I pray when I have on my conscience the awareness that I am co-responsible for the death of innocent people in Vietnam? In a free society, some are guilty, all are responsible. Oppression of workers, ecological devastation, war, poverty, lack of health care, violence, corruption, slander, these are all religious issues to the prophet. God holds us all responsible for taking on these issues. There is zero separation between the acts of the guilty and the inaction of everyone else, because we are all responsible. And when society collapses, we all collapse together. There is no individual right to not engage, because we are all responsible. This concept is a little troubling for us in the modern era, but there's also zero separation between God and state for the prophets, because there is complete covenantal relationship between God and humanity, and that demands our moral responsibility for each other. And the state is just one of many organized ways for us to be co-responsible for each other. Abraham Joshua Heschel sarcastically once said, I would say that God seems to be a non-religious person, because if you read the words of God in the Bible, God always mixes in politics and social issues. God, you should worry about spirituality and not about politics and social injustice? Do you hear how ridiculous that sounds? The prophet would often begin with the nightmare, describing what the reality of their time was, and mercilessly critiquing those in power with biting words, harsh critiques, sharp rebukes. Ezekiel said that your politicians are like wolves who devour the poor, and your priests give them cover. Isaiah said that your rulers are like rebels who are partners with thieves. They chase after bribes, and the widow and the orphan's cause does not come before them. They went after the rich and the powerful, the fat cows of Bashan who lounged on their couches while their workers suffered and struggled, the greedy king who took the meager possessions of the poor peasant, the false prophets who pretend like they speak for God, when in fact they speak for their own power and their own wealth. The prophets hated vanity and pomp and circumstance that was divorced from the reality of suffering. They hated official holidays and official ceremonial rituals. Isaiah said, I hate your festivals and I hate your fast days, because true repentance and celebration are not performative acts. The goal is to unlock the chains of injustice, to free the slaves, to do away with the artificial cruelties in our society. The prophets also hated idolatry. To them, idolatry was valuing property over people. It was forsaking God's concern for humanity. It was when people would rather acquire gold and silver and power than help each other, than serve their neighbor, than welcome in the immigrant and loving the stranger. And so all of these crimes that the prophets would outline, these crimes of violence and corruption and idolatry and slander and hate, these crimes would lead in the prophetic worldview to wrath and to judgment. And oftentimes when we think of the prophets of the Hebrew Bible or God, the God of the Hebrew Bible, oftentimes wrath and judgment are first and foremost in our thoughts. Because that wrath and judgment are the response of God to our crimes. For the prophets, God is the force of history, but that force of history is in response to us. When we mess up, we get hurt. Bad things happen. And this God cries with the suffering and sends death and destruction to the people. This God both sends the Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar to sack Jerusalem in 586 BC, but is also weeping with the exiles who are sent to Babylon. Our world has a moral compass, and our collective crimes and injustices result in our collective pain and suffering. When we do bad things happen. The prophets called this divine judgment and divine wrath. A good example of this from our era is Abraham Lincoln's second inaugural address, which he delivered in January 1865. And in this address, he said, as the Civil War was raging on, "If we shall suppose that American slavery is one of those offenses which, in the providence of God, must need come, but which having continued through its appointed time, he now wills to remove, and that God gives to both the North and the South this terrible war, as the woe due to those by whom the offense came, shall we discern therein any departure from those divine attributes which the believers in a living God always ascribe to him? Fondly do we hope, fervently do we pray, that this mighty scourge of war may speedily pass away. Yet, if God wills that it continue until all the wealth piled by the bondsman's 250 years of unrequited toil shall be sunk, and until every drop of blood drawn with the lash shall be paid by another drawn with the sword, as was said 3,000 years ago, so still it must be said, the judgments of God are true and righteous altogether." We talk about these kinds of things often in our society, of our original sins of slavery, of colonialism, of genocide of indigenous peoples. And those original sins don't disappear. We reap what we sow. And that's the nightmare that the prophets express, that our crimes catch up to us. But we don't have to sow violence. We can instead plant love and build a world of love. Martin Luther King Jr. summed up this prophetic formula with start with the nightmare, then move to the dream. So let's talk about the dreams here. The dreams of the prophets are grand. They're still relevant and probably will be for a while. We know some of the famous dreams, like Amos's dream, that justice rolls like waters and righteousness like a mighty stream. Or Isaiah's dream that nation shall not lift up sword against nation, and neither shall they learn war anymore. Or that the lion and the lamb will dwell together in peace. These are the dreams of the prophet, a world without war, a world of peace where enemies love each other. And the prophets pushed a few concrete ideas, a few stories that really summarize where they're coming from. One of these stories that the prophets talk about often is the idea of Shabbat, the idea of a day of rest, the idea that part of the dream is being able to enjoy life. Part of the dream is being able to take a day off, to be able to celebrate, to be able to exalt, to be able to be with family and to be with community, and to not always be working. And this is in direct contradiction with what the king would often be saying, which was work, 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 work until you drop, and then we'll replace you. The prophet was always, always pushing for a day off, to take some time to enjoy the world. The prophets also, Moses tells the story of manna. Manna in the desert was what the Israelites ate. And in the stories about manna from the Torah in the desert, we really learn the prophetic ideal of abundance. So just like how in Shabbat, with the idea of the Sabbath, you don't have to work all the time. With the idea of manna, you don't have to be struggling all the time to survive. There's enough. There's enough for everybody. There is enough in the world. There is an abundance. And with the manna, the people had to trust that it was going to be there tomorrow. You couldn't collect more than one day's worth of food at a time. You had to trust in the world, that the world would provide, that there is enough, and it's going to be there tomorrow. You don't need to hoard your wealth. There is enough. It'll be there tomorrow. The prophets also pushed the idea of Jubilee. Jubilee is defined in Leviticus chapter 25, and it also shows up on the Liberty Bell. The quote on the Liberty Bell is from Leviticus 25, I believe it's verse 10. "Proclaim liberty throughout all the land, and unto all the inhabitants thereof." And what that means to the prophets, what the Jubilee means to Moses and Isaiah and others, is very well defined. It means freeing all of the slaves. It means the land gets to rest, that you're not overworking the land and causing ecological devastation. It means that you break up concentrated wealth. It means that all property reverts to its previous owners from 50 years ago, so that land and wealth and the means of production don't become concentrated for any one person or group of people. The Jubilee is the trumpet blaring of justice. And the concept of it is that we don't actually own the wealth. We don't actually own people. We don't actually own the land. That for the prophets, the earth is the Lord's. The earth belongs to God. And we just happen to be temporary occupants of it. In Leviticus, they define land purchases not as buying the land, but as buying time on the land, because everything passes. The prophets were often fighting for what we would call basic human rights. They fought for a fair and equitable economy. They fought for healthcare, for dignity, for the widow, the orphan, the stranger, the immigrant, children, elders, and all those who are marginalized. They were fighting the social justice fights of their time, which are sadly a lot of the social justice fights of our time. But to reduce them to activists, to reduce them to people who fight for human rights is unfair to what they were about. It reduces them too much. Because the prophets weren't just fighting for issues. They weren't just fighting for better wages or for better, safer workplace conditions or for abolition of slavery or for redistribution of land and wealth. The prophets were pushing an alternative consciousness that stands in stark contrast to the consciousness of the king, that stands in stark contrast to the consciousness of Pharaoh. The prophets believed in abundance versus scarcity. They believed in love over fear. They believed in justice over tyranny. And they believed in reality over the arrogance of those in power. They weren't just going after single issues. They were attempting to deconstruct the fundamental axioms, the fundamental hypotheses that undergird our entire society, the ideas that everything else flows from. They were trying to deconstruct those, tear them down, and rebuild a world of love in its place. And a lot of these issues that they talked about, and a lot of these underlying philosophies and ideologies are very much present in our time. We believe in the US society that property has more rights than people. That's idolatry. That's what the prophets were against. Just this past week, there were pictures of, I saw pictures of a dumpster outside of a supermarket where all of the food had been thrown away because it was going to spoil. And hungry people were coming to the dumpsters to get the food out. And the state had sent police officers heavily armed to guard the dumpsters and keep the people hungry. Again and again and again, we value property over people in this country. We value scarcity over abundance in our society. We constantly hear the refrain from politicians, how are you going to pay for that when it involves poor people? When it involves rich people, tax cuts are endless, subsidies are endless. There's no concern there. We live in an artificial scarcity, which is in stark contrast to the world of abundance that we actually live in. We also live in a time where we fall again and again for the pomp and circumstance and the hypocrisy of those in charge. We buy into the ceremonial rituals of arrogant people who are doing harm to the general public. We applaud for them at their official meetings. We show up when they're getting sworn in and we cheer them on, even though they're doing harm. And the ultimate dream of the prophets, as summed up by Moses, might just be to create a nation of priests and prophets, to create a holy nation, to create a holy people. And that's easier said than done. But the prophets give a lot of advice for how to get there. They talk about loving justice and walking with humility. They talk about crying out in the public square and encountering those in charge and challenging the king and making the king cry and making the high priests feel something and making them feel responsible. And they also said, the prophet Zechariah says, that not by might, not by force, but through spirit alone shall we all live in peace. And pursuing peace and justice, that's the task that the prophets hold us to account. That's the task for which we are all responsible. And that we cannot achieve peace and justice through brute force, through violence, through cleverness, through wickedness, that we can only achieve a world of love through love itself. And that's the challenge that we're after. And I'm going to close with just some words about Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel and how he looked at the world. He lived his life between two poles that represent the prophets quite well. On one side of the spectrum of how he saw the world was the Baal Shem Tov, who was a rabbi who lived about 300 years ago, for whom life was a celebration. The Baal Shem Tov danced and sang, was always happy, always moving around, cheering people up. The Baal Shem Tov was pure joy. And on the other side was the Kutzker Rebbe, who lived about 150 years ago in Ukraine, or Poland. And the Kutzker Rebbe was basically in a mute standoff with God. The Kutzker Rebbe would cry out to God, why? Why is there so much suffering? Why is there so much poverty? Why is there so much pain? Why is there so much violence? But when the Kutzker Rebbe would cry out, he would see a mirror in return, that the divine was holding up a mirror to show the Kutzker Rebbe that it's us. We're the ones killing each other. We're the ones hurting each other. We're the ones starving each other. That the world is full. The world has abundance. The world can sustain us. The world is kind. The world wants us to exist. But it's us who are hurting each other. And so the Kutzker Rebbe, though, would take that mirror and flip it back on the divine and say, why is there something instead of nothing? Why are we even here? That's on you. That's not on us. And so God and the Kutzker Rebbe were in a mute standoff, where the Kutzker Rebbe just couldn't even say anything because of how overwhelming his own responsibility was, but also how overwhelming the burden was on God as well. And so it's on us. The prophets teach again and again and again that life is a partnership, that history is a partnership between us and the divine. And that if we approach with the sympathy for the divine, the overwhelming sympathy for the divine, that will lead us to create the world of peace, where God will turn to us and be gracious upon us. Thank you all.
I'm gonna tell you fascists sure might be surprised. There's people in this world, and we're getting organized. You bound to lose, you fascists bound
Thank you. Thank you, Rabbi. I'm always feel privileged to hear your words. And thank you for sharing your wisdom with us. At this time in our service, we take this opportunity to reflect on what it means to be a self-sustaining and life-giving community. One of the goals of our congregation is to encourage all who gather here to be generous both in spirit and in action, and to bring each of us closer through acts of creation and compassion. We will now take an online offering that allows us to exercise the all-important generosity of spirit, an offering that will support this self-sustaining congregation and its various ministries. Please look in the chat to see how you can donate online. Also, today's undesignated offering will be shared between our congregation and the YWCA Racial Justice Team, which strives to transform social inequality in our community, our schools, and organizations through education and open dialogue. And because we are in our stewardship campaign, we're going to hear a special video by Linda Bergdahl about our church's Conversation Club that reaches out to people who are learning English as a second language. Finally,
Hi, this is Linda Bergdahl. I am the chair of the Conversation Club. Conversation Club is a group that meets at UUCY. Well, we did until COVID. We met in the carriage house in the past, and our purpose is to give English language learners a place to use their new skills. So we are not teaching English per se. We're giving students a forum in which they can ask questions, have conversations, play games, and use their English skills. We've been doing this for a number of years now, but of course, due to COVID, we have had to change some things. We did Zoom classes from last March until this past December. We found that a few people were dropping out because they weren't getting enough time to speak and to participate. So we're trying something new this month. We're doing conversation partners, and we're pairing a volunteer with 1 to 2 students. And it's turned out to be, we've had 2 weeks of this and we've really seen great results. We have more participants. So we could always use a few more volunteers. If you're interested, get in touch with me. My name is Linda Bergdahl. My email is lebergdahl@gmail.com. You can also find that in the directory. Our students are all adults. They are from as far-flung places as Austria, Germany, Mexico, Japan, Honduras, Guatemala, Mongolia. We have people from everywhere, and it's really a joy to get to know these folks. So if you're interested, please get in touch with me. Thank you.
now I will turn it over to Rabbi Michael to give us closing words of wisdom.
Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel was born in 1907 in Poland. In 1933, he got his doctorate from the University of Berlin the same week that Hitler rose to power. In 1938, he escaped to England, where he learned English as his seventh language